parallel that.
Man, remember the good old days when Zoom didn't talk to you about that?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to start admitting people. And then Sarah, if you want to admit more, just for the moment, I'm distracted doing Facebook. That's
Sure.
Great. Here they come.
Welcome, everyone. Seeing a lot of folks still connecting to audio, so we'll give it just a second. So welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to see you all this morning. My name is Sarah. I'm here with Sky Island Alliance. As we're joining, I would love to hear where you're joining from. So feel free to type in the chat where you are joining from and where you're listening in from. Tempe, Arizona. All right. Tucson, lots of folks from Tucson already. Cochise, Arizona. All right. Fantastic. Oh, Denver, Patagonia. This is great. We've got folks from all over the West already. Green Valley. All right. Well, the other question I wanted to ask everybody is, do you have a favorite spring?
And I'll send this out in about 15 minutes.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, team.
We've got a lot of background noise, so as you're joining, please feel free to mute yourselves. But yeah, please go ahead, type in the chat where you're joining from and what your favorite spring is, if you have one. If you don't have a favorite spring, maybe by the end of this talk, you will have one.
I was gonna say it looks like just.
Fantastic. Thanks, Emily. So once again, my name is Sarah, and I'm with Sky Island Alliance. I'm really excited today to be here with all of you and with Don Swann from the National Park Service to talk about springs. So welcome. We've got folks joining from everywhere across Arizona, California, Colorado. It's really fantastic. Here in Tucson, the offices of Sky Island Alliance are on the traditional lands of the Bana Aldam, Pascoyaqui, and other Indigenous peoples. And Emily is going to post in the chat right now a link to our land acknowledgement and some of our other resources about traditional lands here in the Sky Islands. From my perspective, I wanted to tell you all real quick, my favorite spring is actually not even really that exciting. It's a little tiny seep in the Santa Ritas, and the reason I like it is because it's a clue as to where the groundwater is. And you can also see the groundwater down in caves in that area. And so I really like it because it kind of connects all those pieces in my head. So hopefully, as you are watching Don's presentation this morning, you'll get the chance to think about your favorite places and how those springs relate to you in your daily life. So if you couldn't already guess, today we're going to hear all about springs. Here in Western North America, we don't have a lot of surface water like rivers and lakes, but we've always had thousands of springs throughout our Sky Islands. One of the programs that we run here at Sky Island Alliance is called Spring Seeker, where we have the help of our volunteers going out onto the landscape, finding springs and assessing their current condition. And then we can use that information, we share it with our partners, and we can figure out places where we want to do restoration work and really take care of these special places. So when you're out there at springs, for those of you who have gone out and looked at some of these springs, one thing that always strikes me is that we see a lot of evidence of past human use, like troughs and tanks and pipes. And a lot of times those are in disrepair. They're not currently being used anymore. So with that in mind, I asked Don if he would be willing to give a talk about the history of these special places. So today we're joined by Don Swann, who's a biologist at Saguaro National Park here in Tucson, where he has had the pleasure of working for almost 3 decades. Don is involved in a wide range of projects at the park, including saguaro monitoring, wildlife, and water conservation. He has an undergraduate degree in geology and biology from Brown University in Rhode Island, and a master's in wildlife and fisheries from the University of Arizona. As a reminder, as we go through the talk, please remain muted, but feel free to type any questions into the chat. We will be very pleased to address those at the end of the presentation. And with that, I would like to pass it on to Don. Welcome, Don.
Thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate the invitation to talk about a topic that I'm passionate about, and I'm glad that other people are interested. Before I start, I would like to just thank Alexis Cardenas and Janelle Gunn, who have done some of the research in the last few years. So are you sharing the, there it is. Okay, so the northern sky island that I'm going to talk about is the Rincon Mountains. You can see Rincon Peak with snow on it in the background and Rincon Creek in the foreground. And there's probably snow up there today from the storm the other day. Next slide. This talk was really inspired by the Sky Island Alliance and Spring Stewardship Institute for what they've done to kind of bring attention to these amazing places with water over the last decade or so. And I've really learned so much from you guys and really appreciate it. Next slide. And I've also been inspired by a wonderful book about the Rincon Mountains by Jan Bowers, The Mountains Next Door. And in that book, one of the descriptions is of Deerhead Spring in the 1980s, which practically saved her life one day. And I'll just read that we saw untrammeled water, cold and clear and pure, flowing from a dry hillside. And she went on to say that Deerhead Spring promises that we will never lack for water, nor for the things of the spirit, the deeper wisdom that welling up inside us nourish us and keep us alive. And I know a lot of us feel that way about springs. And I've worked, as Sarah said, at the park for almost 30 years. And I remember when Deerhead Spring gushed back in the 1990s, but it's been dry now for more than 20 years. And so part of this is just exploring, what are the reasons some of these mountain springs are going dry? Is it because of climate change, or are there other reasons? Next slide. And so the question today, really, this is a photograph of Deerhead Spring from the 1950s from our archives. The question is, how have people used and managed springs in the past, and what does this mean for us as wilderness managers today? So I want to emphasize I'm not a historian, but I am a natural resource manager, and I'm really interested in using history to help us make good decisions for how we can manage the land going forward. Next slide. And we've all seen these remnants of springs. If you hike around in the Sky Islands, you see random pipes crossing trails and water troughs and tanks. And so I know a lot of you are probably just as curious as I am, and many of you may know more about this than I do. Next slide. I have a couple of goals today. First is just to talk about the value of water. For most of human history and a lot of the world today, we as humans need to drink water and every day. So we need to have our communities near a source of water, or to carry it from a distance where we can carry it. We can turn on the tap, in Tucson today, but most places in most of human history, that's not possible. Next slide. And so, we've founded our communities here in the desert Southwest near springs. This is Quito Baquito Spring, which was the site of an autumn village for many years before the Park Service took over. Next slide. And when we see springs in the Sky Islands, this is a spring that we, quote unquote, discovered a few years ago. It had never been mapped before. It's tempting to think of this as a pristine area that people have never used, but it's more likely that this spring was very important to somebody in the past. And in fact, there's artifacts located all around this particular spring. Next slide. The goal I have is just to kind of bring awareness of this problem of extraction. So a spring by definition is where water reaches the surface of the earth. But as you know from hiking around, a lot of these springs are just wet areas where the groundwater is just at the surface or below the surface. And if we were trees, we could just sink our roots in and get that water, but we're not trees. Next slide. We're sort of like bears. We've been putting video cameras on these springs for the last few years, and black bears love to wallow in springs, and I've convinced myself that they're one of the reasons why some of these mountain springs retain their surface water. All of this activity around springs by black bears. So they're stewards in a way of the spring. Next slide. But people have always been extremely creative in extracting water from the near surface of the ground for thousands of years, whether it's by digging wells or putting in windmills or building dams across streams or pulling water out of springs. And so this creativity is really kind of fundamental to who we are as people. Next slide. But a lot of that is hidden, and I think especially around here. So this is a crude cartoon that I made of one of the things I think happens around springs in the Sky Islands. First, you have groundwater coming up and being at the ground surface. And at some point in the past, maybe hundreds of years ago, someone added some sort of structure that would retain the water and make it more available for people. But then over time, that area stopped being needed for that. The sediment built up, number three, and then more sediment, and then vegetation started to growing. So a lot of the structures that would have indicated human management of the spring are buried and not visible to us. Next slide. Many times I wish that I had the X-ray vision of Superman to see beneath the ground surface. And if I did, I'd probably have more specific information about the history of these springs today. Next slide. What we do have is traditional knowledge. And so the Park Service did a project a few years ago with the Sky Island Alliance to interview ranchers in Sonora and get input from them on how they manage their springs. And so that was really useful, but there's so much more of this that needs to be done. I think it's really our responsibility to be good listeners and to go out and seek this knowledge and to pass some of this traditional and indigenous knowledge of how springs have been managed in the past, and then really pass that on to the next generation of spring stewards. Next slide. So in this talk, I'm going to take kind of a traditional historical approach, going from sort of uses in the past, hunting, gathering, farming, ranching, through some of the uses of springs in the present, after the Wilderness Act, and looking at biodiversity. But I want to emphasize that this is just a construct. There are many places in Arizona and Sonora where all of these activities are still taking place around springs today. Next slide. For sources, again, I'm not a historian, but we've gone out to springs or we've found structures out there and used that as a key. We've looked for historic photographs from our archives. In the National Park Service, we're fortunate that we have a lot of old maps that have been preserved, particularly old grazing maps that often indicate where the springs were. And then there are just records of different springs and how they've been managed that are in the archives. Next slide. So the Rincon Mountains are a northern Sky Island at the northern edge of this region in terms of the mountains and their ecology. I'll also talk a little bit about the Santa Catalinas. If you stand on the University of Arizona campus and look down Speedway or Broadway to the east, you'll see the Rincons there. And the Park Service manages about 100 square miles in Saguaro National Park. Next slide. The Rincons have many kinds of springs and many springs, and I won't describe and all the different types, the Rio Crane springs and Hillslope springs. That's probably the topic of another talk. But there is water out there. Next slide. The Rincons are the ancestral lands of many native people, including the Tohono-O'odham, the Sobaipuri, Western Apache, and other tribes who have been stewards for this land for centuries and who are still really deeply connected to these mountains. Next slide. They're managed today as a federal wilderness area by the National Park Service and Forest Service, and this is to protect their excuse me, their natural character. But this is definitely not to say that they are untouched or pristine. Like most wilderness areas, they've been really a working agricultural landscape for thousands of years, and we are still tied very much to the economy of the area. Next slide. And just evidence of that, everywhere you go in the Rincons, you'll see rock structures associated with agriculture, whether it's terraces for agave production. And the diagram from the Hohokam book on the right just shows the Rincons and their connection with the tributaries of the Santa Cruz River. And those economic connections were very deep and remain so today. Next slide. I personally don't know very much about indigenous management of springs in the Rincon Mountains, but what we do know is that settlements typically occur around sources of perennial or semi-perennial water. That's as true in the desert as it is in the mountains, where we find cave shelters and other evidence of prehistoric use in the high elevations. Next slide. But we can presume that they were developed and maintained, maybe similar to the way springs are maintained today on the Hopi tribal lands. This is just an example of a spring restoration project in northern Arizona. Next slide. When the Apache were defeated and forced out of the Rincon Mountains in the late 1800s by the U.S. government, it opened up these areas really for the first time to European farming. So this is a map from 1893 showing the Rincons with the Rincon Valley kind of in the center of the map. Next slide. And so the area was developed starting in the 1870s, primarily by Mexican-American farmers who created homesteads in the Rincon Valley and farmed for corn and beans, fruit trees. Rincon Creek does flow and so could sustain some crops from the flow, but a lot of these homesteads were established along springs that still occur in lower Rincon Creek today. Not all the springs are perennial and quite often the crops failed. Next slide. There was also farming up in the mountains, and so from the 1893 map, we know there was cabins at what we call today Manning Camp at 8,000 feet, and Spud Rock Meadow with a little bit lower elevation on the east side of the Rincons. Next slide. And there were farms in those areas. We know most about the Manning family, which was definitely not a traditional farming family. Manning was the mayor of Tucson. But they improved the spring at Manning Camp, put a small dam in, we believe, for farming purposes. Next slide. We don't have any photographs of the earlier farms there. We think probably started in the 1880s, but this is a photograph of the farmlands in 1906. And they raised various garden crops. Next slide. And then Spud Rock Meadow was developed. Again, this is a photograph of the original cabin that dates from the 1800s and a newspaper clipping about two Southern Pacific Railroad engineers who raised potatoes and cabbages in that area that they called Spud Rock for their major crop. And Barnett fell from his horse one day coming down the trail and was killed. So they'd bring the potatoes down into Tucson to sell. Next slide. Also starting in the 1870s was intensive ranching in the Rincon Valley. Initially, again, by Mexican American farmers and ranchers who often had a few cows and relatively small open allotments without any fencing. The Rincons became part of the Coronado National Forest in the early 1900s. And by the 1920s, the Forest Service had started to manage this grazing a little bit more, and a lot of the smaller ranchers were subsumed into larger allotments, primarily Anglo ranchers by the 1920s. Next slide. And this is you can see this is a fairly big operation. I think this is the Fred Knipe Ranch in the Rincon Valley, sometime in the early 1900s. Next slide. So there was significant water development for livestock during this period of time in the Rincons and Catalinas. Cattle need to drink water on a regular basis. There's not a lot of water out there in the desert. And so the ranchers were very creative. They created these earthen dams like Garwood Tank, which we still have in the park today. They put dams in streams like Box Canyon. Next slide. And then what they consider to be springs and that they developed to some extent that we don't know a lot about were just a variety of different water sources. So some of these are clearly tinajas that have a flat enough entrance that cattle are able to get into. So these are two perennial tinajas in the Rincons that we know of that were called springs, and probably developed somewhat by ranchers, but that most of that development's been lost. Next slide. This is still in existence today. The steel tank. Rock Spring was developed with a dam, and then water was piped down to a tank for cattle use on the Tanque Verde grazing allotment. Next slide. Some of these springs, if you look at the old grazing records, this is an account from 1928. This is Jarillo Spring in the photo, and they're talking about another spring nearby, Encino Spring. And these are actually kind of seeps in the rocks that were often blasted to try to improve water flow, and then a pipeline would be constructed to a trough. Sometimes the blasting must have worked sometimes because they kept doing it. Next slide. But sometimes it didn't work. So this is Bear Wallow Spring up on near Rincon Peak on Wrong Mountain in the Rincons. It's the site where the last grizzly bear in this area was killed in the early 1920s. And I interviewed a number of years ago a rancher from the Happy Valley, Ollie Barney, with Lisa Haynes, and Ollie told us that the spring was blasted, and after that it went dry, and it was a very poor water source after that. So as I said, it doesn't always work. Next slide. I just thought I'd throw in here. This would be sort of a typical kind of springbox for a diffuse spring. So the idea is to put a structure in the ground that will collect the water that's flowing through the ground, and then to pipe that water down to a place where it would be more accessible for cattle or for wildlife or for people. And so this is a pretty typical spring development that you would see in the Rincons and Catalinas and lots of other places as well. Next slide. This is Jelk Spring. The water supply permit was given. These are handwritten notes from Robin Pinto, historian. And so he was given a permit in 1929. And at one time, this was a very productive spring within the current boundaries of Saguaro National Park on the south side that produced all of the water needed for the X9 ranch, which was a pretty large ranch operation. And this was in place for decades. You can see the pipe coming out of the springbooks. So the Rincon Mountains became part of Saguaro National Park in 1933. Grazing isn't allowed in national parks, but it had been part of the Forest Service agreement prior to that to allow grazing to continue. And so grazing did continue for a number of decades and was gradually phased out in Saguaro National Park, with the last grazing allotment retired in 1976. That was in part because of concerns about cattle ranching affecting the saguaros. Grazing obviously continued in the national forest and continues to this day. Next slide. Following World War II, there was much more interest in managing wildlife. There was a recognition that wildlife was not doing as well as it could be because of poor management. And so spring development started to focus on multiple uses, including benefiting wildlife such as deer and other species. And so you'll see more development of water for wildlife after World War II. Next slide. Some of this took place in the park, but because there wasn't hunting here, not as much, but there was quite a bit of development of wildlife waters in the Catalinas, and I assume throughout all the Sky Islands during the 1960s and through the 1970s. This is just a partial list of some of the springs that were developed in the Catalinas, and a poor photograph of Spencer Spring in the 1960s. Next slide. So these were Arizona Game and Fish Department projects done through special use permits with the National Forest Service. And you can see the purpose, I got this out of a report, is to provide permanent water for wildlife, especially deer, turkey, bear, golden eagles, peregrine falcons, and other smaller species of birds and mammals. And oftentimes they were either rehabbing old spring developments or developing new ones, and there would be quite a detailed plan of the work to be done, and then a sketch map and photographs accompanying these different reports. Next slide. And then some of the work was done by Game and Fish personnel or Forest Service personnel, but also by volunteers. And I found this cute Eagle Scout project of a rehabilitation of a spring in the 1970s. Next slide. These springs were maintained, and they kept pretty good records. This is the maintenance sheet from Maverick Spring, and I'm grateful for Josh Taves from the Forest Service for providing this information to me. And they were maintained throughout the 60s and 70s into the early 1980s. Next slide. And then some of them have continued to be maintained. Josh and others in the Forest Service have rehabilitated some of these springs, like Maverick Spring and Shovel Spring. And then others, you'll see the troughs out there in the forest that are no longer maintained, like this one at General Hitchcock Campground. Next slide. So I just touch on a couple of other differences in spring management between the Rincons and the Catalinas. Catalinas have a highway that goes up to the top. They have the village of Summerhaven at the top, and the Rincons don't have, those kind of developments. So the spring development in the Catalinas, much of it has been directed towards development for the community of Summerhaven and for camps and other human needs for larger amounts of water in the Catalinas. Whereas in the Rincons, it's more focused on single campers and things like that. Next slide. A major exception to this is that starting in the early 1900s, right through the early 2000s, there was a fire crew based at Manning Camp up at 8,000 feet. And their job was to find fires as they started and then go put them out. And so they were based there, and they would either ride to the fires or hike to them. And so up in the upper right is looking through the fire lookout on the Mica Mountain Tower, and there's a photograph of the cabin and a fire school in progress during the 1970s. And so next slide. These firefighters lived up at Manning, and they needed a source of clean water. And so sometimes the water at Manning in the spring would get polluted, so they constructed a dam and a reservoir in the 1950s and a water system that is actually still there to this day. Next slide. They had another developed site at Spud Rock, and so the development at Spud Rock also in the 1950s put in a springbox and a water tank to hold water during the dry season. And this was a big project, and they said worth every cent is the improved water and storage system at both Manning Camp and Spud Rock Cabin. That was a report for 1958. Next slide. And then a lot of the smaller springs, and we don't have too many photographs of this, were developed for firefighting. So again, as the firefighters went around and did their initial attack on small fires before they became bigger, they needed a source of water. And so Italian Spring was developed for being able to fill up water packs easily. Art Spring was developed in the 1960s. Art Jensen was a firefighter up on the mountain. He still hikes in the Rincons today. We ran into him when we were doing a project at Spud Rock a few years ago. And he developed that spring for firefighter use in the 1960s. Next slide. One of the major changes in spring management in the Rincons started in the 1970s. In 1964, Congress passed and the president signed the Wilderness Act. And the idea of the Wilderness Act was to create federal wilderness areas that are generally managed so that they are affected primarily, and I'm quoting here, by the forces of nature, with the imprint of man's work substantially unnoticeable. And so it was a shift in policies for federal lands. And in 1976, the Saguaro Wilderness was created. It's just a picture of a snowy scene in the cactus forest. Next slide. And so with the wilderness designation in Saguaro National Park, the superintendent, requested and provided opportunities to remove many of the structures that were there. So for example, the Mica Fire Lookout was removed in the early 1980s. We don't know a lot of details of what happened at the springs, but there are notes here and there in the superintendent's reports that the structures around each of the springs, Italian Spring and Spud Rock Spring and Mudhole Spring, et cetera, were removed during the 1980s. Next slide. One spring continued to have continued to have developments. That was Blackberry Spring or Turkey Spring on the east side, where water was piped out to a grazing allotment in the Forest Service, and the park eventually removed that development over the ranchers' protests in 1989. So by the time I started working in Saguaro National Park in the early 90s, most of the springs, had this natural appearance, and most of us assumed that they had always been that way. Next slide. But in working in the park all these years, one of the things I began to notice was that some of the springs at high elevations that had been, that hikers and campers had told me had always been reliable, were no longer reliable by the late 1990s and into the 2000s. And that's true for Deerhead Spring and Mint Spring and Spud Rock Spring, which is shown here. It's a photograph taken in 2017. And Spud Rock Spring today is dry most of the time, and when it does have water, it's very poor quality water. And when we were interested in what might be causing the loss of water from these springs about 5 years ago, and we're studying the geohydrology, we came to Spud Rock Spring and we just were kind of scratching our heads because it doesn't look like a place where there should be a spring from a geologic point of view. And in poking around, we noticed that on the upper right-hand side of this photograph, there was, under the surface of the ground, there was a large massive concrete slab. And we just wondered what happened here in the past. And so we went into the archives and we looked for photographs. Next slide. And we found the photograph on the right that I've shown before. And so in this photograph on the right, A is the old tank that stored the water. C is the old spring box, and B is the pipe that runs from the spring box over to the water tank. That would have been in the 1950s. And then when we dug, we got permission from the park to dig, and so the original foundation for the tank is to the right side of what is called Spud Rock Spring today. The old pipeline was still in the ground next to that, and was still getting water from the spring box, which was buried up on the hill above that. And so we poked around and we found where the old spring box was, and saw that the pipe still ran water down to what was called Spud Rock Spring, but really wasn't the spring at all. It was just at the end of the pipe where the tank used to be. Next slide. And so the spring box was full of pieces of concrete and metal and logs, and so we dug it out and we found the original spring box, which still had water in it, but it was really dirty water. Next slide. So what we've done is we cleaned it out. We put a temporary cap on it, and what we're trying to do now is make a decision about what do we really want to do at Spud Rock. It's an important campground, but it doesn't have a reliable water source, and so the park has a decision to make as to whether we want to rehabilitate that spring or just remove it completely, which would be much more kind of what we would normally do as part of the wilderness policy in the Park Service. The photograph on the upper right shows the meadow above the spring, and you can see it's a meadow that's wet certain times of the year. Infiltration of the spring is primarily during the winter when there's heavy snow. I don't know whether there was ever an open spring at Spud Rock. Next slide. In that area, there's a large aspen grove, and so groundwater is very close to the surface, but it may be that the water that was used for farming and probably prior to that by Native Americans was developed by people to make it more accessible. one of the things that we're kind of thinking about is just how we kind of manage camping and hiking in the Rincon Mountains in the future. And right now, a lot of our campsites are associated with springs, but there are other springs in there that might be more accessible for campers. And so we're providing we're starting to provide some of that information to backpackers going through, and just kind of over the next few years, probably just thinking a little bit more about water in the high elevations. People that hike on the Arizona Trail and come through the park absolutely need to drink water every day, and so they need to have access to these springs, and we'll just need to kind of really think about that going forward. Next slide. And then, I think today we're kind of moved into a new era, and people are exploring the concept of managing springs to preserve biodiversity. Certainly when we look at the work that the Skyline Alliance is doing and other groups, we're interested in really protecting some of the really most amazing natural resources, whether it's wildlife or plants that we have in the Sky Islands that are associated with and often very dependent upon spring water. Next slide. In the Rincons, we have been exploring springs, trying to locate springs that have never been mapped before and look for rare plants. And in the last 3 or 4 years, we have discovered, I think, close to 30 now new species of native plants in the park that had never been documented before, many of which are associated with springs, like this giant chain fern, and this pretty rare Thurber's bog orchid. Dan Beckman on the left is our park botanist, and has really been making some really great strides in sort of rediscovering these springs, and in some cases rediscovering plants that haven't been seen for quite a while as well. Next slide. And then I think I'll kind of leave it up to all of you in terms of what the implications for spring restoration are. In terms of some of the historical material that we're discovering. I think those of us who have worked in public lands for a long time kind of recognize that there are many, in a way, when you talk about restoration, you really need to be sort of thinking first about what are the goals here, what are the resources that are available, what are the best ways to kind of balance what our needs are with other realities on the ground. And so this is just an example on the right of, this is a pretty recent photo from Pima County Natural Resource Department of a spring at the Bar V Ranch where they're trying to protect their ringo plants. And I'm particularly interested in restoration of springs as refugia for lowland leopard frogs when we have really large fires that inundate these stream habitats with sediment and make it impossible for the frogs to live there. Can we use springs as a refugia for these frogs? But there's so many options out there, and a lot of people doing a really great work to explore them. Next slide. And then since I work at Saguaro National Park, I can't help but kind of ending with some saguaro photos. This is a photograph of the cactus forest, which is at the base of the Rincon Mountains. It's really the reason that the national monument was originally established in the 1930s. And I show this photograph just to sort of make the point about why I think, as a biologist studying history, is important. This is the cactus forest in 1935, and then the next slide, Sarah, is the same view looking at it in 1998, and it looks pretty similar today, about 24 years later. So there's been this shocking decline in the number of saguaros. So can you go back for a second to the previous slide? So the stunning landscape of giant saguaros, which was such an amazing scenery. And the next slide. And then the far fewer saguaros. What you can see in the second photo is that there are a lot more trees. Next slide. And in fact, there are quite a number of saguaros in this view today. They're just underneath trees, and they're hidden by nurse trees. And it actually takes, maybe 70 years or more for saguaros to actually start to appear above the nurse trees. Next slide. And so this is just a montage of the two different photographs. So really, in some ways, and it wasn't by design, but the story that's happened here is pretty complicated. The trees at the foothills of the Rincons were cut down, beginning in the late 1800s, and so we didn't get a lot of establishment of young saguaros. When the park was created and the trees came back, those nurse trees were really good for young saguaros, and they started to grow again. But on a landscape, if you sort of project it out on a landscape scale, the view on the right, the modern view, will never look like the view on the left. We'll never have that stunning scenery unless we were willing to go out and cut down all the trees again. So kind of understanding that historic context is valuable when we're thinking about, it's easy to look at these two photos and just be shocked and horrified about what's happening, but it's actually a pretty good story in terms of positive for the saguaros. But history and the way we manage the landscape has played an important role in the view that we have today. Next slide. That's all I have to say. As I said, this is I'm not a historian. This is something that I've just gotten interested in. I'm really interested in anybody's insights, understanding of the technology of some of the things that I've talked briefly about. I'm really grateful to Josh from the Forest Service and Robin Pinto, a historian at U of A, and Salek with the Park Service for their insight. They would have a lot more intelligent things to say about some of these things than I would. And then also really appreciate the Friends of Saguaro National Park and WMPA and Sky and Alliance and Spring Stewardship Institute and these organizations that are doing so much to really protect the amazing resources that we have here in the Sky Island area, especially springs. And with that, I will answer any questions if there's time.
Fantastic. Thank you, Don. That is just absolutely a wonderful overview of all sorts of springs related things in the Rincons and the Catalinas. As folks are putting their questions into the chat, I have a quick question about animal stewardship, because I remember you've mentioned that to me before, and this idea of black bear stewards. Has anyone studied that or has tried to do, bear exclusion plots and then seen how the springs evolve? Or is it more just kind of a sense of how these, for thousands of years, animals may have interacted with these water sources?
I've only done a Google search. I didn't find anything, but that doesn't mean no one studied it. And there may be people on the call. I saw Harley on the call earlier, and Lisa that may know something more about it, but yeah, I don't know. It would be really interesting to study. I've convinced myself that this is a really important factor in maintaining surface water in some of these springs.
I wouldn't be surprised. I think it's reasonable. So we do have some questions coming in the chat. So someone is asking, is Squeeze Pen Trail a remnant of the ranching era?
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I don't know. I suspect, but I don't know.
It's kind of interesting, kind of how you ended thinking about the landscape scale change and the landscape scale management and how we still have evidence of that today, even if we don't know what we're looking at per se. So perhaps trail names also.
I could look it up, but I don't know.
Awesome. Okay, so we have a couple of actually kind of a discussion about water developments for wildlife resulting in a loss of plant species. And then Julia comments about how retaining some of the moist soil environments might be a best management practice. So maybe if you have some thoughts about best management practices for that, making it a better source for wildlife, but then also retaining some of the spring snails and those rare plants, I think that'd be really great.
I do, and I in the interest of time, I left out of the talk something that I did want to mention, which is that I think modern spring management for ranchers really recognizes the multiple values that are present at springs, and try to sort of just take sort of split off enough water that's necessary for cattle while retaining the soil moisture. And there's some booklets out there that you can access that kind of give really good technical advice on how to manage springs in that way. But I would totally agree that we want to be able to we want to be conscious of being able to protect moist soils, and the best way to do that is to be creative in terms of using technology and paying attention to it and recognizing the different needs for these springs. I think a lot of people are starting to do that. But we've all seen examples where that's not happening, and that we need to work harder.
So speaking of technology, someone asks, can you use ground penetrating radar to find springs, or maybe to relocate springs that have been lost?
I'd like to think so. Yeah, we haven't tried it, and you know, it's working in the Rincons it's a long hike to get anywhere and a long way to carry equipment, but it's something that we've been discussing and are interested in, and are pursuing, but I don't know how long it will take.
Awesome. We have another question kind of about the loss of springs. So what is the relationship between compaction and soil loss with seeps and springs? So changes in soil and erosion, I think, with seeps and springs.
Yeah, there are. And in some places, they recognizing that this happens, there are places where they actually come in and build sort of like special soil pads for, you know, for cattle to get in where they don't disrupt the soil and create additional erosion. So it is a concern, and it can be mitigated. And I'm definitely not an expert.
Jan wants to know, does Douglas Spring still exist?
Yes. Yeah. And I'm actually really intrigued about, and I haven't been able to find much information on the historic development of Douglas Spring. I've never really looked in that area for any remnants of historic pipes and troughs that might occur. I wouldn't be surprised if there are some, but I've never found any really good photographs or historic references. And if anybody has any, I'd be really interested in seeing them.
Fantastic. We have another question about black bears. So any anecdotal examples as to why you see them as spring stewards? I think you mentioned, yeah.
Well, so when we put videos up on springs, black bears come into springs. They don't just come in to drink, right? They come in to roll around, to wallow, to, you know, to have fun. It's clear that this is like a high point of their day. But we also see them literally digging out the springs. I don't want to make too much of this, but it's clear that that's what they're doing. And once you've seen them do this on videotape, and you approach a spring in the Sky Islands and you look at it, you can just tell by the appearance of it that it's a spring that's being heavily used by black bears. Yeah, anecdotally, I think that's definitely going on. As I said, I haven't done any kind of controlled experiment, and we wouldn't here to put a fence around it, see what would happen to that spring if you didn't let the black bears in for a few years. But I can guess that they might fill in.
Yeah. We have another question about, have you seen any spring flows respond to removal of vegetation by fire?
I think so, but I think it happens. Again, no really controlled scientific data. And maybe people are getting some from the Bighorn fire. What we see after fires, when we look, is that some springs that we expect to be flowing really nicely aren't flowing at all. But do I know that that's because of the fire, or because of something buried in the ground, or because of some other kind of management change, or some, you know, anything else? I can't say. I'm hoping that someone's looking at that with the Bighorn fire. I feel like it would absolutely make sense that infiltration would be reduced following a fire for all of the obvious reasons. The topsoil burns off. You get hydrophobic soils. You get soils washed away. All of those things would be what would reduce or eliminate the infiltration and the source of water into the spring. And so I would expect that to happen. And there's maybe been some work on it, but I haven't done that work.
Gotcha. And then it looks like we have a couple of questions about the kind of trends overall, both related to fire regime conditions, and then kind of vegetation growing back because of the lack of fire for the last century or so, and then an overall trend in spring flow, whether that's been kind of anecdotally noticed, as you mentioned, or if it's been documented, kind of those changes over time that you've seen in your time at the park.
Yeah, definitely only anecdotally at the park. We don't have data. I wish that we had been collecting data on that, 2 decades ago. We are now through the National Park Service Inventory and Monitoring Program. So as far as being long-term trends, I can't say. Even getting at things like have there been long-term trends in the decline of snowpack is really hard to get at. We don't monitor snow in the Sky Islands or in the Rincons, and indirect ways of trying to do that through satellite imagery and stuff has been not successful. Although I think tree rings are probably the best approach. So yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. I feel just based on my own personal experience, I've seen springs that have gone dry or really have greatly reduced flow in the 30 or so years that I've been here. But again, I don't know how much of that is related to climate, how much of it is related to no longer maintaining those springs, or some combination of that. And I don't think it wouldn't be possible to do that retrospectively here. But I think probably there is enough monitoring of springs in northern Arizona that if there were trends over the last couple of decades, they might be seen there.
Sure, yeah, Spring Stewardship Institute might have some of that information for sure. Yeah. And it looks like we have one more question. I visited the cave and the nearby ranch recently and saw a stand of cottonwoods. Is that a nearby spring used by the ranch or accessible to the public? And actually, maybe we could generally talk about, now that people are all excited about springs in the Rincons, if there are some that you would suggest people, go day hiking to or go exploring.
Yeah, so there are cottonwoods throughout the Sky Islands, all the way down into Mexico, and they're associated with perennial water, and I really love the cottonwoods that we find in some of the drier streams coming off Tanque Verde Peak into Tanque Verde Creek. So Wild Horse Canyon, some of those other tributaries do have cottonwood trees. Some of them at fairly low elevations, and we're starting to monitor them to get a sense of whether there's a trend with cottonwoods over time. In the Rincon Creek tributaries, there are quite a few cottonwoods, and clearly cottonwoods are a really good indicator of kind of the health of a riparian system. They do grow up around springs if they can, they got to keep their feet wet. And so if there is that good moist soil that's sustained throughout the year, then you'll get cottonwoods in there. So I don't know the specific answer to the question that Rand posted, but yeah, it takes a long time to grow a cottonwood, but not forever. And recruitment of cottonwoods is complex as well. But we definitely have, they're just amazing trees, and we're so lucky to have them here in the Rincons.
So Rand also asks about the health of agua caliente. I was thinking about in the part of your talk where you mentioned that people would blast springs to hopefully increase the flow, and how at agua caliente, at the hot spring there, they tried to do that and instead reduced it. So what do you think about the health of agua? I know it's a little bit lower elevation, but yeah, any thoughts on agua caliente?
Oh, it's such a complicated question, but agua caliente is sort of just a great example. I'd urge anybody to kind of study the history of it and study the geohydrology of it, because it's just so fascinating. It's water that's coming off the detachment fault that runs along the base of the Catalina and Rincon Mountains, and it's just a really unusual and kind of amazing place. The management there has always been complex. There's always been sort of multiple needs for that water. The county's been doing some really interesting work in the last few years to manage that spring, including encouraging native plants and animals. And so if you haven't been to agua caliente in a few years, I'd urge you to go down there and check it out. And not only is it just a beautiful place, but it is a fascinating place. Yeah, so I as far as the general health, that's just too complicated a question to answer. But I think it gets at the point that I want to make today, which is that the health of these spring ecosystems really depends upon our definition of that, and you can't disregard the history leading up to that, to where we are today. You can't just you just can't flip a switch and suddenly you're managing a spring for naturalness. That's just not the way it is.
Yeah, it's sort of like we can't erase that history. So let's figure out how we can kind of honor that history while also managing for these complex uses into the, coming years. So,
Right.
yeah. Don, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful way to start our days today. Thank you so much. For everyone who attended, if you missed any part of this presentation, it will be on our website later. And so you can actually check that out later. And then we have a couple of upcoming events. I do just want to mention, we have a celebration of our volunteers, many of whom go out to these springs and assess conditions. And so that's coming up, and Emily just posted the link in the chat to be able to attend that. And then also this weekend, we have a trip to Aravaipa Canyon, which is a wonderful place where there is water and springs in low elevations in the desert. And we are removing invasive plants there. So this weekend, if you're looking for something to do, please sign up for that. We do still have space, and Emily will be posting that in the chat as well. Thank you, Don, once again. I appreciate it.
Can I add one thing, Sarah?
Yeah, sure.
So I put my email in the chat, and if there's anybody on the talk that has any kind of additional information or contradicts anything that I might have said, I really am a sponge for this information. I'd love to hear from you, and thank you. Thanks again, and again, thanks so much for this invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Well, thank you very much, Don, and thank you to everyone who attended this morning. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. All right, bye-bye all.